bring in more of the products.
A wonderful explanation, but if once we had liberalization,
yes,
the next question must be,
yeah,
are we going to review this policy and make sure that this doesn't ever happen again?
For purposes of feeding the nation and for purposes of not borrowing food anytime we have crisis, we need to review that particular policy and ensure that we have sufficient reserves to feed the nation.
And
if you look at some other countries...
So we, again, breaking news in the Kenyan context,
yes,
our current parliament is saying the National Cereals and Produce Board is mismanaging the distribution of fertilizer, so it maybe ought to be outsourced perhaps to them.
Okay,
so is that not breaking news? So these are not encouraging signs, Daktari,
yes,
that people who know nothing about anything are stipulating policy.
At the point of decision that National Cereals and Produce Board should distribute fertilizers, I think what the government should have done at that point in time is to try and safeguard the private sector system that was set up to basically procure and distribute fertilizer in this country. There were discussions and disagreement thereby, and therefore the government decided to go about it alone.
Therefore, you're suggesting that some form of privatization is good to let the market set its own standards.
John, it is only in Kenya that you find a government in business. Government is not good in doing business. Private sector has specialized to do business. What we need to do in terms of intervention, we should intervene within the private sector system. But the government shies off in terms of intervening. And therefore we feel like if we buy within the government circles and distribute within the government system, that's going to be considered as a lot more of a subsidy. But we could have subsidized because the issue was not the distribution of the fertilizer. The issue was the cost, because a 50 kilogram bag of fertilizer was going for around 6,400 that time before the intervention. And then after the intervention, it was brought down to around 2,500, 2,750, 3,500, which is fairly manageable. Now, the idea is to look into how do we partner under the private-public partnership with the private sector to bring down the cost of inputs instead of going to do business ourselves as a government. So that's a decision that was needed to be made. Right. So the mistake was for the government to go and imagine that the National Cereals and Produce Board would effectively distribute. The NCPB stores are not everywhere. They're not in every village. Farmers have got to travel for 20, 25 kilometers, 30 kilometers to reach an NCPB. And then the process of distribution itself is riddled with a lot of relative clearance by the Industrial and Agricultural Officer. Then you have to go to NCPB. Maybe the fertilizer has not come. There's so much until the farmers sometimes have had to buy the costly fertilizer from the market, yes, or they have had to do without the fertilizer.
In a way, with respect, Daktari, you're shooting yourself in the foot, yeah, because as a CEO, as a manager, yes, you are not fighting the good fight for your clients. In what way are you fighting the good fight?
We have raised issues.
In what way are we to be assured that there is engagement with government, with people like you? We see cabinet secretaries, sure, we see principal secretaries, all very fine and dandy, but you're the people on the ground. Yeah. You represent the grassroots. Sure. And you're saying to me, you can do nothing about what's happening.
I'm not saying we can do nothing. I'm saying that we can do a lot. Like right now, we are intervening on the issue of the VAT on farm inputs again. But let me go back to the issue of fertilizer and how could we have done it. If appropriately, and let me emphasize, appropriately engaged, we would have advised that it is not wise for a government to import and distribute. That is not the way the government should go. The idea is that the respect for private sector by the government has been, especially the agricultural sector, has been very low. And that is the problem we have in this country. The government feels like it can do business and ignore the private sector and do it best.
Point taken. Point taken. Yeah. Let's deal with another word, pricing. Yes. And we look at the image of another commodity, totally unrelated, petrol in your car. Okay. Somebody says, you know, the cost of petrol, the cost of electricity is going to go up. Yeah. And then we have this decree from on top, from our loving leaders saying, no, fix it. No, the Wananchi must not have an increase in electricity. Yeah. What about the pricing of commodities such as maize, which are the staple food? Yeah. Shouldn't there be a fixed price ad infinitum for the rest of our living days?
In my very considered opinion, we should have a minimum price. And then we should be able to work as a government to intervene to make sure that the minimum cost of production is reduced so that we can progressively reduce the minimum cost of the grain itself.
Right.
Because the greater
otherwise
majority,
there'll be riots, there'll be revolutions.
Of course, people will go to the street if the food will be too costly.
Exactly.
It happened in Asia, it can happen here in Africa.
Exactly.
So the idea is that we need to be looking at how can we make food cheaper by intervening. The idea is we have not adequately invested in agriculture as a country. If a country like this, which is overly dependent on agriculture, and actually you hear certain statements which are unfortunate, like 70% of the population depend on a sector that only generates 24% of the GDP. Right. And that is why we are really poor. I think we need to revisit some of these statements and ask ourselves, if 70% is dependent on 24%, are we not really extremely poor? Don't you think we can do something about it by increasing investment in agriculture through proper and appropriate budgetary allocation? Increase the budgetary allocation and then go back and organize the agricultural sector. It is possible to do it.
Right.
Yeah. Organize the agricultural sector, invest in the agricultural sector, bring the costs down, have cheaper food, have Kenyan happy.
Right. As a final sort of consideration, this was the idea of food security, which is a fancy way of saying that we'll have enough to feed our people in this country. Dr. it seems to me, it's just a question, maybe it's unfair to you, that some of the most arable and most fertile land in this country is given up to produce that basically people can't eat. If there's tea, coffee, this is being grown for export on the best land to plant 50 million kilos. I exaggerate to prove a point. What is your view as an expert on that issue? In terms of policy, again, for the rest of our living days, should certain areas of Kenya be put aside to produce such as tea and coffee?
I'll go back to land master planning, because that's what countries have done and moved very far.
Well, you spoke about it, but so you're going to say there should be a master plan that changes all this?
Precisely.
But you also said, Daktari, that with regard to small-scale farming, that this is the way it's always been. So I'm going to say, can we expect radical change in the way that we view our agricultural lives?
We need to look at the priorities. In fact, the greatest problem we have is utilization of agricultural land in the alternatives, non-agricultural activities. Like we have constructed immensely on agricultural land, we have utilized agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes. I think we need to revisit that. For instance, Nairobi is sitting up on Kiambu, which is the wrong thing. We are taking up very potential land and putting up permanent structures that are taking up that land forever. The second thing that I would like to say in terms of ensuring that we have food tomorrow is to look at what is of most economic benefit in each of those zones now. And that is how we can improve and develop this country. If it's coffee, let's do coffee the way it has never been done, so that we exploit the potential of that. We challenge that soil to give us the best, and therefore we are able to channel the marketing, and also we start some small scale processing, whereby now we start employing our people. We have treaties under the One Trade Organization that basically leads to escalation if you process, and the extent of processing increases the taxes you pay. Those are some of the things we need to go and debate over. We need to go and negotiate, because we've never, as in developing countries, we've never really taken these issues clearly at the global level to be allowed to process our products and sell them as finished products.
The final question is that there's talk of Vision 2030, 17 years from now. Will we be a hungry nation? Can you predict that far? Or will we have enough policy measures to make sure that we have enough to feed our people?
It will very much depend on what policy options we take as a country. It will depend on what kind of mechanisms we put in place, the strategies we put in place to enhance land productivity. It will also depend on how much we use the 80% of ASAL land that we have in terms of irrigation, the extent to which we can quickly open up the 1.1 million hectares specified in the Vision 2030 into irrigation. We are growing at a very low percentage. The rate of growth is very low in irrigation. We have natural potential of 540,000 hectares, which we haven't done. So if we could do the natural potential before we go to enhanced potential to reach 1.1 million, then we'll be moving towards self-sufficiency in food. Again, we need to reorganize our agricultural production systems. That cannot be overlooked, because most of the land, the potential land, which could again, assist the government in terms of natural, food production through rain-fed agriculture without necessarily going to irrigation. That needs to be exploited. Then we also need to think about small-scale based irrigation systems. Instead of looking at large-scale open irrigation, we have models that have worked. Even in this country, we have models that have worked under small scale, and we need to think about that. We are letting a lot of our water and soil, for that matter, go down the drain instead of conserving and irrigating it and increasing food productivity of the land. That's
Dr. John Mutunga, we have to stop there. Thank you very much for being on the JSO interview.
Thank you.